Bismillahirrahmanirrahim. Dr. Farooq Musa, Elma Berisha, Dr. Haidar Bagir, Dr. Faizal Musa, para hadirin yang budiman, Assalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh. Salam sejahtera, peace be with you. I'd like to begin by thanking Islamic Renaissance Front for this very kind invitation. What I'll do in the time allocated to me is to address the topic itself, violence and persecution in the name of religion. I shall address this theme from three dimensions. One, the history of violence and persecution in the name of religion, in very brief terms. Number two, the underlying reasons for violence and persecution in religion. And number three, the solutions to this challenge of violence in religion. Let me begin with the first dimension, the history of violence in religions. There is perhaps no religion, as far as its actual experience is concerned, that has not been used or abused in the name of violence. Every religion that we know of in history. If you take, for instance, the ancient period, not many of us would be aware that Hindu sects in India, individuals, groups within Hindu sects, they fought and killed one another in order to establish their supremacy. There were also violent struggles between some Hindu groups and Buddhists in ancient India, especially after Buddhism became a major force in large parts of India. That's the ancient period. If you look at medieval Europe, we know the sort of violence attributed to Christianity. Again, groups, individuals, misusing the religion, misusing the teachings of Christ, which can in no way be associated with violence, but misusing these teachings in order to kill, in the medieval period, Jews and Muslims. We know of the Crusades, which were directed at Muslims outside Europe, but also at Jews. A lot of Jews were killed by the Crusaders. And the Crusaders also killed Christians. The Crusaders from Europe, Western Europe, killed Eastern Christians, the Christians associated with Constantinople, the Eastern Church. Now that's part of history. And the medieval period and what had happened. And then of course the Inquisition, where thousands of Muslims and Jews paid the price. Now if you come to the contemporary period, you have groups amongst Muslims killing fellow Muslims and others, again in the name of religion. Both my colleagues, Haidar and Faizal, had referred to this. Killing fellow Muslims, killing people of other faiths. And in the contemporary period, you also have Christianity, elements misinterpreting Christianity for the purpose of violence. But again, you don't even see it. Why? Because these would be elements amongst the Christian right, supporting, endorsing mass killings in pursuit of their agenda, like what has been happening in Iraq, in other parts of West Asia. And you have, of course, Jews killing Muslims and Christians in Palestine and in other parts of the world. Again, misusing Judaism, but doing something which all the other religious communities have done, killing people of other faiths. And you have, of course, Buddhists in Myanmar killing in the name of religion, misuse of Buddhism without any doubt at all. Or Buddhists in Sri Lanka indulging in acts of persecution. You have Hindus in India killing non-Hindus, again, a very small minority, but in the name of religion, including people who consume beef, being killed in their homes for consuming beef. So you have this phenomenon in the contemporary period. Muslims, Christians, Jews, Buddhists, Hindus, all of them involved in killing and violence. So that's the first part that I want to establish. Don't see this as a phenomenon related to a particular religion. It is something which cuts across religious boundaries. It is something which has happened right across time. In other words, in all periods of human history, we have to get our perspective right when we talk about violence in the name of religion. The underlying reasons, the second dimension that I want to deal with. Again, it is amazing that if you look at the underlying reasons, in most instances, there are internal reasons and there are external reasons that explain violence in the name of religion, the abuse of religion. Both internal and external reasons. By internal, I mean reasons related to doctrine and religious personalities. External would be socioeconomic, sociopolitical, sociocultural. It could also be geopolitical, both in terms of global economics, global politics. It could be all these reasons that would be external to a particular religion. So both internal and external would be the underlying reasons, and you find this happening over and over again. If you look at the situation confronting Muslims as a way of explaining this, the internal dimension, a lot of it has been referred to by the two previous speakers. You have Wahhabism as an ideological factor that's internal to Islam. And the takfiri dimension, which again is internal to the religion, but not new. It has happened before in history, and it has happened over and over again in history as far as Muslims are concerned, but it's also happened in the case of other religions, where they regard some people as pure, others as impure, people outside the faith, and so on. And of course, you have religious preachers and religious authorities contributing to this. That would be part of the internal dimension in Islam. And it's a very powerful factor. We can't deny it. Sunni Shia is internal in that sense. It is doctrinal, it is ideological, it's internal. But if you look at the internal dimensions that explain violence in Islam and in other religions, you'll find that they're always external factors which one cannot ignore. What are the external factors as far as contemporary Muslim societies are concerned? Of course, socioeconomic factors, the struggle for power in a particular setting that is socio-political, socio-cultural, the way in which religion is linked to culture, which may, in a sense, be at variance with the religion, but nonetheless, it is there. And part of it is seen in Malaysia from time to time. A lot of the narrow interpretations of Islam are actually cultural, but then they have an impact upon our society. And they may contribute towards hatred towards the other But the external factors that are not highlighted as much as they should be in the case of the Muslims are related to larger geoeconomics and geopolitics. They are there, they're very powerful, but they're not highlighted for obvious reasons. Because those who run the world, those who control the world, they don't want this to be highlighted. And all of us, including a lot of Muslims, get trapped in this discourse about what is happening, and the problem is with Muslims, and Muslims are put on the psychiatric couch and analyzed endlessly by both non-Muslims and Muslims, while you ignore this other factor. If you take, for instance, the Sunni-Shia conflict, there is a very powerful external dimension to it. The periods in which it has been highlighted, it has come to the fore. If you look at the present phase, for instance, it is linked to the 1979 Iranian Revolution. And there were people who were very unhappy with the Iranian Revolution. And the people who were unhappy with the revolution were people who were linked to vested interests, which in turn were linked to the way the world is structured. To be more specific about this, the Sunnis of Saudi Arabia had no problem with the Shias of Iran before the 1979 revolution. In political terms, of course, there were theological differences, we know that. But between the House of Saud and the ruling class in Tehran, relations were actually quite good. Relations were quite good. Why? As I've said cynically very often, because they were facing the same Qibla. And what was that Qibla? Washington. Washington was the Qibla. So their relations very good between the leaders in Riyadh and the leaders in Tehran. But once the revolution took place in Iran and the geopolitics of the region changed, you know, the US lost its most reliable grip upon that region apart from Israel. It was Iran. Everything changed after that. So the Shias became the enemy, and this huge propaganda against the Shias, the spread of Wahhabism, the way it was sponsored, popularized by not just Saudis, believe me, but others who had control over the media, who knew how to popularize this sort of antagonism towards the Shias. And it is still with us in different manifestations, but it's there. So that is what I mean by the geopolitical dimension. As I said, there is also a geoeconomic dimension. I'm explaining these things in very brief terms. These are very complex issues. Look at the geoeconomic dimension. What happened in the 1970s? The projection of Muslims as violent, as bloodthirsty, it wasn't there to that extent in the 60s, if you look at the literature on the politics of that period. Why? In spite of the 1967 war, which of course the Arabs lost in 6 days, the Six-Day War. But there wasn't that projection of Arabs and Muslims. It began in the early 70s, at least for the contemporary period. Why? Because of the oil crisis. Why? Because two Arab leaders tried to reorganize OPEC, the Organization of Petroleum Exporting Countries. They tried to reassert the rights of the producers over oil. The two countries were, of course, Libya and Saudi Arabia. They tried to reorganize, reassert their rights, demanded more just prices, and there was a reaction. Caricaturing Arabs, Muslims, the Western media, it became very, very widespread, linking them all the while with violence and so on, linking it to the 73 war, linking to Muslim history and all the rest of it. This is very well described in a very interesting book by the late Edward Said, who was a Palestinian Christian. A book entitled Covering Islam. Every journalist should read this book covering Islam. The pun is on the word covering, covering Islam, where he shows very clearly that this was an extremely well orchestrated attempt to defile, to demean Muslims and Islam because of the economic change that was taking place. The reorganization of OPEC was not just confined to OPEC, as you know. It was the reassertion of the South in terms of the global economy. The new world, new international economic order, all those ideas emerged out of the 1970s. A real attempt to reassert their power, which failed in the end, of course. But for that period, it made an impact. So they had to be discredited. And it was done in a very willful, organized manner by the global media linked to the centers of power in the West. So this is the geopolitical, geoeconomic dimension which we should not forget. Also the domestic factor, whenever you have people with power and they want to suppress a more progressive interpretation of Islam, of course they would want to demean the other side, and this has happened all the while. So let's keep that in mind when we talk about the reasons, the internal and the external, and how the external impacts upon the internal and vice versa. Let me now look at the last part of my presentation is on solutions. On solutions. And here again, this two-pronged approach. We cannot run away from the reform which Brother Haidar talked about, very, very important, that Muslims themselves must spearhead. Reform in terms of our thinking about our religion. A thinking that offers a counter-narrative. A thinking that offers a counter-narrative to bigotry, to reactionary notions about the religion, to superficial literalism, a counter-narrative that looks at the dynamic spirit of Islam itself. It's all-embracing, universal, inclusive dimension, which is what Islam is all about. It's concerned with the whole of humanity, not just sectarianism, which it's opposed to, because the religion that emerged at that point in time, a continuation of all the prophecies and teachings of the past, which is what Islam has always seen itself as, a continuation, was totally opposed to sectarianism. It was all embracing. Now we have to restore that. We have to restore that progressive dimension which understands what redistribution of wealth means in reality, what genuine Islamic finance, if you want to use that term, what it really means, not just what parades as Islamic finance in the name of Islamic banking and things of that sort. What it really means, the concern, the commitment is to justice, not just to external forms. There's a lot of work to be done. And I don't think over the last 150 years, Muslims have made much progress as far as this sort of reformist thinking is concerned. There have been many attempts, but the forces against them are very strong. And these forces are not just external to the Muslim world. In fact, the more powerful forces are within the Muslim world, which suppress this sort of thinking. So that is a very important dimension. There is also the larger geopolitical, geoeconomic dimension, forces external to the religion, which is also a huge task, how to bring about changes of this sort. Within Muslim societies, fighting authoritarianism, fighting elitism, fighting the type of structures that have emerged which deny dignity to the vast majority of human beings living in these societies. And it's not just Muslims, it's everyone. And the issues involved are not confined to Islam per se. These are socioeconomic, socio-political challenges that go beyond religion. And we have to address them from that perspective, not in terms of religion per se. Because if we do that, we are missing the whole point. So that is a very big challenge. But there is also the global challenge, because today more than ever in the past, you cannot talk about change, you cannot talk about bringing about a more genuine, progressive understanding of Islam without addressing the global dimension. And the moment you do that, you can't just talk about 24% of the global population. You have to think of the rest, which means you have to talk in terms of Christians and Jews and Hindus and Buddhists and people who have no religion. You have to talk of humanity as a whole in this larger challenge. And here again, you find that not many Muslims speak that language. Not many Muslims talk about challenges that confront other human beings. Most of the time, they're concerned about things that happen within the Muslim world. But human suffering is human suffering. It doesn't matter where it occurs or who the victim is or who the perpetrator is. We have to develop that sort of perspective. You take, for instance, the tragedy of the Rohingyas. It's a terrible tragedy. But we must also be concerned about other tragedies that have befallen other people, and not just be concerned about Rohingyas because we feel, well, these are fellow Muslims. I think this is a wrong attitude to take, especially if you're seeing at challenges from a global perspective. The others who are suffering. This is also the reason why you find that Muslims, especially in our part of the world, in Malaysia in particular, we tend to see Palestine as a Muslim cause, when it is not. Palestine is about justice. It's about human dignity. A lot of Palestinians see it in terms of justice and human dignity, not as something that is just confined to Muslims. We do a terrible injustice to the Palestinian cause by reducing it to a Muslim cause. We have to get out of that sort of thinking. We have to become genuinely universal and inclusive, not just in terms of rhetoric, which is very easy, but in terms of commitment, in terms of what we are able to demonstrate in real terms, in terms of our action. This, I think, is a real challenge that confronts us. And for that, and I go back to what my colleagues have talked about, both Faizal and Haidar, knowledge is very important of our own situation, of the situation of the world. Unfortunately, a lot of people who set the tone and tenor of religious discourse, they're not that knowledgeable about the global situation. They're not that knowledgeable about the global forces at work, what shapes the economy, what shapes technology, what shapes politics. They're not very knowledgeable. So they reduce everything to simplistic religious dimensions. It's so very important for us to get rid of that sort of mentality, to look at it in a different manner, develop our knowledge, our understanding, fathom the underlying causes, come up with solutions that embrace the whole of humankind. And one would have thought that here in Malaysia, we have a fantastic opportunity to develop that sort of thinking, because we are a multi-religious society where we are forced to, by the very nature of our existence, to think beyond our own borders and boundaries. But are we doing it? We are not. What one is very disturbed by is the increasing tendency to reduce everything to ethnicity or religion. Instead of getting out of that sort of thinking, developing a more inclusive, universal approach, we find that 60 years after independence, there is less of that sort of all-embracing, universal, inclusive thinking. We tend to become more and more parochial. We tend to become more and more sectarian in our approach and defend it in the name of Islam, which I think is wrong. Let us have the courage, because that, I think, is the most important thing in bringing about change. The courage, the integrity, to articulate a different discourse in addressing issues like this, violence, persecution, see them for what they are, and persuade people that this is very important in the actual struggle against violence and persecution. Otherwise, you are strengthening trends and tendencies which in a few years' time will undermine the entire edifice of Malaysian society. Thank you very much.